We are live. Hi guys, how y'all doing again? So we are here on night 7, I think it is. I think from here on out I'm just going to stop keeping track because it's just going to hurt my brain. I've got my coffee ready to go. I got some other drinking agents ready to help me. And before I start, what do you guys think of the complete botch job that I would have done if I had done this? Hopefully my wife Alicia helped me out. So yeah, second day of the life crisis, I guess, is in full effect. She helped me out. I would have just completely ruined it. And then with the dark facial hair and everything, I realized I look like Steve Carino. And if you don't know who that is, there you go. Yeah, former ECW Steve Carino, who would often get very bloody in his matches, and the blood with the blonde hair was it was a sight to see. But we're here to talk about The Hobbit. Woohoo! Alright, so we are going to start with Chapter 6. We're now going chapter per video. Hopefully these don't take too long, because I realized... Let me move... There. Now if you can hear me better, that's probably why. I realized reading whole chapters at a time does take a little longer, but if I didn't do that, then this would take, forever. So, let me get another sip of coffee. I know tea is better, but I like coffee. I'm going to wash it down. Alright, here we go. Chapter 6, Out of the Frying Pan, Into the Fire. You know, J.R.R. Tolkien was not very good when it came to naming some of these chapters. They're very bland, but let's get into it. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on until the sun began to sink westwards, behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward, and could only see before him only ridges and slopes, falling towards lowlands and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. Good heavens, he explained. I seem to have gotten right to the other side of the Misty Mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where can Gandalf and the dwarves have gotten to? I only hope, to goodness, that they are still not back in the power of the goblins. He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down the slopes below. But all the while, very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether or not now he had the magic ring to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding down with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side of the ground slipped away. There were dwells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, were people talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw, peering between two big boulders, a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin, doing Outlook. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant. And he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. I will give him all a surprise, he thought, and he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves, and they were all discussing what had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying they could not possibly go on their journey without leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He has been more trouble to us so far," said one. "If we have to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess at best as you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before it is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?" Look at Gandalf being all accusatory there. "You would have dropped him," said Dory, "if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back." "Then why didn't you pick him up again?" "Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Oakrest. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we all saw goblins running back and yelling. You shouted, 'Follow me, everybody!' and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter out of there. And here we are, without the burglar. Confusicate him." "And here's the burglar," said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it in a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with the praise that he had just chuckled inside and said nothing whatsoever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did, he just said, "Oh, crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it's the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted," said Balin. "I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," said he. "And your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Very cordial, these guys. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after that they had lost him, and he sat down and told them almost everything, except about finding the ring. Just not now, he thought. Then they were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered almost appreciatory at his description of Gollum. Description? Yes. "And then I couldn't even think of any other question with him sitting beside me," entered Bilbo. "So I said, 'What's in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and I ran, and I fell over, and I missed him in the dark. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he just sat down at the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't they there any?" "Oh yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was the only open a crack, and I lost a lot of buttons," he said, sadly looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect, and they talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through as though it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than any of you guess." He gave Bilbo a strange look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again and where he had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once, so now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountain, but their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so they often caught people benighted near their gates? I guess resting near the gates. Eventually, people had given up going that way, and the goblins had opened up their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently because it had been found quite safe up to now. I must see if I can find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf. Or soon there will be no getting over that mountain at all. As soon as Gandalf heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. Did I miss something? No. Okay, that's just how it goes. What? As soon as Gandalf heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash, which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the... Oh, they're talking about back when the goblins first grabbed them. Okay. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the Great Hall, and there could be sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it is, he said. Touch and go. But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks the old Took's Midsummer's Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. They made that gate ages ago, he said. Partly for a way of escape, if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come into the dark and do great damage. They got it, always with no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubtedly after this, he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin, and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. We must get on at once. We are now a little rested, he said. There will be out after us in hundreds when the night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon if it keeps fine, and it is lucky. Not that I mind the moon that much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh yes, he said, in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We would have gone miles and miles, come right down through the heart of the mountain, and now we are on the other side. Quite a shortcut. But we are not at the point with which to pass would brought us. We are too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead of us. And we are all still pretty high up. Let's get on. I'm so dreadfully hungry, growled Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt almost empty, as loose as his legs all wobbly. Now the excitement was over. Can't help it, said Gandalf. Unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage. No, thank you, said Bilbo. Very well, then, we must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that would be much worse than having none ourselves. As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but blackberries were still only in flower, and there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a little bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank. Hey, strawberries, score. But it was not much. Or it wasn't much. It wasn't much. The They still went on and on. The rough paths disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-chopped turf and thyme and sage and majoram and the yellow rock roses, it all vanished. And they found themselves at the top of the wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remainder of a landslide. When they all began to go down this, the rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went chattering down and started other pieces below them, slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounced off, crashing down with dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them, and slowly they seemed on the move. They were sliding away, hurtled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pine and stood right there at the mountain slope from the dark forest of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves onto lower branches. Some, like our little Hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the distant stones went bouncing and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf. "And even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bombur, "they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down to our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy and were rumbling their bruised and damaged legs from feet. "Nonsense! We are going to turn aside here for the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down. They could still see the evening lights on they were able down, the gentle slopes of the pine forest in a slanting path, leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken tall fronds rising above the Hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, when it was so dark he could only see Thorin's beard waggling beside him. It was so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is waging like an empty sack." Waging? Waging. Wonder what that means, waging. Waging like an empty sack. "A bit further," said Gandalf. I like how I'm reading his narration like Gandalf. Like, as said Gandalf, yes. After what seemed ages further, they suddenly came to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was slicing through the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them, not all at the same place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl, and down the hill a long shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by not too far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins, of course on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil pack that lives under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountain, over the edge of the wild, on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and do not see you to catch you. Do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves?" he said, and became a proverb, though we now say, "out of the frying pan and into the fire," in some sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees, quick!" cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees to the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low, or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as they could, you could guess, and they went up as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves climbing up in the trees and having a seat with their beards dangling below, like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Feely and Keely were at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dory, Nori, Ori, Gloin, Oin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out in intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Biffer, Bofer, Bomber, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir. There's a lot of different trees in this forest. Didn't figure like so many trees would cluster together. I don't know what this is supposed to represent. The Dwalin and Balin swarmed up a tall, slender fir with a few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery on the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree in which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as they peeped out. And Bilbo? He could not get into any tree and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit that had lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori to Dory, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dory. "Down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls all around them now, getting closer and closer. "Dory," he called for Dory was lowest in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hugged his arm down as far as he could, as Dory actually climbed out of the tree to let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Things are getting tense. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dory did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had climbed off his shoulders onto the branches, and he jumped for the branches himself, just in time. A wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up, and nearly got him. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yipping all around the tree and leaping up at the trunk, with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves under the edge of the wild were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily, it was a swarm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for a long time, but in the cold and the wind, with wolves all around below waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. The glade in the ring of trees was eventually a meeting place for the wolves. More and more kept coming. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dory and Bilbo were, and then went sniffling until they had smelt out every tree and had everyone in it. These were guarded too, while the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed went and sat at a great circle in the glade. In the middle of the circle was a great gray wolf. He spoke to them in dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, as if all their talk about cruel and wicked things it was. Even now, when all the wargs in the circle would answer, their gray chief all together, in their dreadful clamor, almost made the Hobbit fall out of his pine tree. I will tell you that Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped each other out in wicked deeds. Goblins did not usually venture very far from the mountains, unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I am glad to say has not happened for a long time. But in those days they were somewhat used to going on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. They often got to the wargs to help them and share the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that the great goblin had been planning on that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the Great Goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of all this fair land, bold men had been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees, but building themselves to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even wargs dared not to attack them if they were many together or in the bright of day. Now they had planned with the goblins' help to come by night upon some of the villages nearest to the mountains. If their plans had been carried out, there would have been none left the next day, and all would have been killed except for the few goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. So they're about ready to go on a raid. And somebody stepped up and ruined that. This was a dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodsmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which has now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them at the very meeting place. They thought they were friends of woodsmen, and they'd come to spy on them. They would take news of their plan down to the valley, and then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people wakened suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up in the trees escape, at any rate not until morning. And long before that, they said goblin soldiers could be coming down the mountain, and goblins climb trees or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid. Wizard though he was, and to feel that they were a very bad place, had not yet escaped at all. And all the same, he was not going to let them have it their own way, even though he could not do very much, stuck up in the tree, with wolves all around on the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cone from the branches of his tree. Then he set one alight with blue fire, and threw it whizzing among the circle of the wolves. It struck one in the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, another in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle and went off in colored sparks and smoke. A specially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose, and he leapt 10 feet into the air, and then rushed round and round in a circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all of the forest. Wolves were afraid of fire at times, but this was most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got on their coats, it struck and burned into them, and unless they rolled around very quick, they were all soon in flames. Very soon, all of the glade wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their back, while those that were burning were running around about and howling and setting each other alight, till their own friends chased them away and fled them down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. Set your dogs on fire. What is the uproar of the forest tonight? Said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting back in the moonlight at the top of the lonely pinnacle of rocks at the eastern edge of the mountain. I hear wolves' voices. Are the goblins at mischief in the woods? He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leapt up to follow him. They circled up in the sky and looked down upon the ring of wargs and a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles, the Lord of the Eagles, but eagles have keen eyes and can see many a thing in great distance. The Lord of the Eagles of the Misty Mountains had eyes that could look at the sun without blinking, and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below, even in the moonlight. So that he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves, and see the tiny flashes of fire, and hear the howling and yelping coming up faint from far beneath him. And he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets, and long lines of the wicked folk crept down the hillside from the gate and wound into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel. But the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves, and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but they could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountain. Tonight, the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot, so he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and round they came down, down, towards the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing, too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves that had been caught fire and fled into the forest had set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on the eastern side of the mountain that had been little rain for some time. Yeah, Floridians know all about that. Dry season, fire season. Yellowing bracket, falling branches, deep piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All around the clearing of the warg's fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the tree. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks, cursing the dwarves in horrible languages, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red, as fierce as the flames. Then suddenly goblins came running up, yelling. They thought a battle with the wooden was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed their shafts against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed to them most amusing. Wait a minute. Didn't Gandalf, scare a bunch of them off with fire? Or I guess it's just light they don't like. Some got all the wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood around the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out, but they did not put out the fire nearest to the two trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and a flame all around the dwarves, a ring that kept the spearing out from spreading outward, but it closed in slowly until the fire was licking the fuel pinned under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of the flames, and though the reek, he could see the goblins dancing around and round in a circle, the people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside of the ring of dancing warriors with spears and axes stood the wolves at a respectable distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning a horrible song. All right. This song was not in the Hobbit Peter Jackson movie, but it was in the Rankin and Bass animation. I'm going to try. I'll try it. 15 birds in 5 fir trees. Their feathers were fond in a feathery breeze. But funny little birds, they have no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive, or stew them in a pot, fry them and boil them and eat them hot. Then they stopped and shouted, Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nest. Sing, sing, little birds, what don't you sing? Go away, little boys, shouted Gandalf in answer. It isn't bird nesting time. Also naughty little boys that play with fire get punished. He had to... Okay, this is an interesting interaction. He said it to make them angry and to show that he was not afraid of them, though of course he was terrified, even though he was a wizard. They took no notice, and they kept on singing. Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch, to light the night for our delight, yah-hey. Bake and toast 'em, fry 'em and roast 'em, till beards blaze and eyes glaze. That's horrible. Till hair smells and skins crack, fat melts and bones brack. In cinders lie beneath the skies, so dwarf shall die, and light the night for our delight. Ya hey, yara hey, ya hey. And with that ya hey, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment it spread to the others. The bark caught fire. The lower branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed to the top of his tree. Then suddenly splendor flashed from his wand like nothing. Wand? I thought he had a staff. Roll with it. From his wand like lightning, as he got ready to spring down from on high right among the spears of the goblins. That would have been the end of him, though they probably would have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leapt. Just at that moment, the Lord of the Eagles swooped down from above, seized him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, for whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back wept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like huge black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth. The goblins yelled and stamped with rage, and flung their heavy spears away in vain. Over them swooped the eagles. The dark rush of them beating their wings smote them to the floor or drove them away. Their talons tore at goblins' faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up now as far as they dared go. Poor little Bilbo was very near left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's legs, as Dory's boar was last off, and up they went together above the tumult and the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below the goblins and the wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and swooping above the battleground. The flames above the trees sprang suddenly up in the highest of branches. They went up in the crackling fire. This was a sudden flurry of sparks and smoke. Bilbo had escaped only just in time. Soon the light of the burning was faint below, a red twinkle on the black floor, and they were high up in the sky, risking all the time in strong sweeping circles. Rising. Bilbo never forgot that flight. Clinging on to Dory's ankles, he moaned, "My arms! My arms!" But Dory groaned, "My legs! My poor legs!" At the best of times, heights made Bilbo giddy. He used to turn strange if he looked over the edge of a quiet little cliff, and he never liked ladders, let alone trees, never having had to escape from wolves before, so you can imagine how his head swam now. When he looked down between the dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening wide beneath him, torched here and there with the light of the moon on the hillside rock or stream in the plains. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming nearer, moonlight spikes of rock sticking out of black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. His eyes shut and wondered if he could hold on any longer. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. The flight ended only just in time for him, just before his arms gave way. He loosened Dory's ankles with a grasp and fell to the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. There he lay without speaking, and his thoughts were a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire and fear lest he fall from that narrow place onto the deep shadows of either side. He was feeling very strange indeed by his head in this time after the dreadful adventures in the last 3 days, with next to nothing to eat, and found himself saying aloud, "Now I know what a piece of bacon feels when it's suddenly picked off the frying pan on a fork and put on the shelf." Okay, run with it. "No, you don't," said Dory, answering, "because the bacon only knows that it will get back in the pan sooner or later, and it will be hoped that we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks." "No, not a bit like Forks, I meant, said Bilbo, sitting up and looking anxiously at the eagle who was perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, as if the eagle would think it rude. You ought not to be rude to an eagle when you are only the size of a hobbit and are up to his eyrie at night. The eagle only sharpened his beak on a stone and trimmed his feathers and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up. The Lord of the Eagles bids you to bring your prisoners to the great shelf, he cried, and was off again. The others seized Dory in his claws and flew away with him into the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just the strength to wonder what the message meant by prisoners, and to begin to think of being torn up like supper like a rabbit when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seized him in his talons by the back of his cloak, and swooped off. This time, only a short way. Very soon Bilbo lay down trembling with fear on the wide shelf of the rock in the mountainside. There was no path on it to save by flying. There was no path down except by jumping over a precipice. There he found the others sitting with their backs to the mountain as well. The Lord of the Eagle was there and speaking to Gandalf. It seemed Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all. The wizard and the Eagle Lord appeared to know one another slightly, and only to be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the Eagles and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners, as he had meant, prisoners rescued from the goblins only, and not captive of the Eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized that they were going to escape really and truly from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away and settling them down well on their journey across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men lived. They would shoot at us with their great bows of yay, whatever. He said, for they would think we were after their sheep, and after times they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport, and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southward plains. Very well, said Gandalf. Take us where and as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you, but in the meantime, we are famished with hunger. I am nearly dead of it, said Bilbo in a weak little voice that nobody heard. That can perhaps be mended, said Lord of the Eagles. Later on, you might have seen a bright fire on the shelf of a rock and the figures of the dwarves around it cooking and making a fire roasting smell. The eagles had brought up dry boughs for fuel, and they had brought rabbits, hares, and small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help, and anyway he was not much use at skinning rabbits or cutting up meat. I thought hobbits were good cooks. I guess they weren't good butchers. Being used to having it delivered by the butcher all ready to cook. I'll just shut up and stop with the commentary. Gandalf, too, was lying down after doing his part in setting the fire going, since Oin and Gloin had lost their tinder boxes. Dwarves have never taken to matches even yet. So ended the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep comfortably, though really he would have liked a loft and butter bit better than this bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on a hard rock, more soundly than he had ever done in his feather bed in his own little home. But all night he dreamt of his own house and wandered in his sleep into all different rooms, looking for something he could not find, nor remember what it looked like. That is chapter 6. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We will pick this up again. How long did we go? We went 45 minutes. Not bad. Last night we went an hour, 45 minutes, so that's cool. That's great. What you see here, this is going to be different tomorrow, more than likely. So, guys, thank you for tuning in. Go ahead and give this video a like if you haven't already. I see a couple already, so thank you. That really, really does mean a lot to me. And I hope you're enjoying it, because I'm enjoying reading. Go figure. Usually I sit in a bed and I read a book and I'm asleep after a page or two. But this has been going for like 7 nights strong. And we're going to go again probably tomorrow night unless something pops up. But I'm aiming for tomorrow night. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Thank you so much.